Speaking of alpha, who has seen the movie Titanic? Anybody? It's the best transition I got. Okay, good amount. Didn't plan that one. The movie Titanic, now you can watch it and you can fall in love with a young Leonardo DiCaprio. I'm curious how old he is in that movie. And I can't tell if they made him look like older, but he seems very young. Anyways, yeah. So, not my boy crush. If you watch the movie Titanic, we see a history playing out. We see the difference between classes. We have the upper floor, we have the bottom floor. We see the difference between experience on the same, call it ship, and we can relate a lot of things to our own lives, and especially the differences between the way people experience lives. Now, one thing is true to the movie Titanic is that as you watch it, the boat hits an iceberg and all of a sudden starts to take on water. And if you look at the upper floor down to the bottom floor, they start to experience things very differently. On the upper floor, there's a big shake and they get tossed a little bit and they kind of wonder what's going on, but life can kind of still start to play out. You can actually be a little bit oblivious to what's happening down below. You're still eating dinner, you're still sleeping, they're still enjoying themselves. But what's up top wasn't the true depiction of what was happening below, as those who were on the lower class running the ship were taking on water. They are slowly trying to figure out how to solve this problem, but then they get to a point of just trying to find rescue, trying to survive. And it becomes very quickly, the metaphor here through Titanic is that no matter what things look like on the surface, at some point, the things below are going to rise to the top. At some point. And you and I can live very oblivious lives. We have a surface to our lives that sometimes looks great, sometimes looks challenging, but either way, there are things below that will eventually rise to the top. And as we continue our series this morning, Open Hands, Receiving Through Releasing, if we consider our lives right now, if we consider the chaos in our lives, the turmoil, the economic instability, the things that are challenging, whatever is going on in our culture, in our lives right now, we can at the same time just experience a surface of things. Depending on how our work is going, depending on how our relationships are going, depending on how we're doing financially, there can oftentimes be two levels going on. And when things are mostly uncertain, through the series, what we're kind of uncovering is that when things feel unstable, when things feel chaotic, we tend to grab hold of things to find a sense of control. We tend to grab a hold of things and to hold on to things so that we can feel good about the things that are going on either externally or maybe even less aware of the things that are going on internally. And for ages now, people who have followed God have practiced in this season, the 40 days leading up to Easter, which is traditionally called Lent, they've practiced releasing things to create space to receive from God. And what I want to invite us into this morning is to consider releasing, indulging in our guilty pleasures. To actually release the guilty pleasures that we have in our life and indulging them. Does anyone have a guilty pleasure? Go ahead and turn to your neighbor and tell them you're just kidding. Don't do that. Now, with that said, guilty pleasure can be very broad. Some people's heart rate started beating a little bit faster and face went flush. Other people are like, yeah, I don't know, I do this, I do that. Depends on where you're at. But what I did to try and find a little bit of a center here on what we're talking about with guilty pleasures, I turned to Chat GPT. Anybody? No, the whole new AI system that's slowly taking over, where we just don't need to think or have, we can just go type in something, talk with it. It'll pull all the information from anywhere. If you haven't done the whole Chat AI, Chat GPT, I encourage you, just go have some fun with it. So what I did is I asked Chat GPT, I know I don't expect you to be able to read this photo, by the way, I'll read this. But I asked it, what are some examples of guilty pleasures? And it said, in all of its brilliance, guilty pleasures are things that people enjoy but feel ashamed or embarrassed about because they are considered lowbrow, indulgent, or culturally unacceptable. Here are some common examples. Binge watching reality TV shows like Keeping Up with the Kardashians or The Real Housewives. Eating junk food like fast food candy or potato chips. Listening to pop music or cheesy love songs. Reading romance novels or fan fiction. Playing video games for hours on end. Watching nostalgic children's cartoons or animated movies. Shopping for unnecessary items like clothes or accessories. Spending too much time on social media or the internet. Dancing to cheesy pop songs or guilty pleasure music. This thing has something against pop music. I don't know. Something happened back in the day. Let it go, man. Watching romantic comedies or cheesy movies. It's important to note that there's nothing inherently wrong with enjoying guilty pleasures as long as they don't cause harm to oneself or others. People should feel free to enjoy the things they love without feeling guilty or ashamed. And that last sentence I would agree with, that there is a level in which we have freedom to enjoy the things that we find pleasure in, even if it could be a quote unquote a guilty pleasure for whatever reason. It could be, on a weekend, like some people would say, a guilty pleasure is taking naps. I don't find any guilt in taking naps. Like, I will take naps the rest of my life. Now, at what point do our guilty pleasures become beyond guilty pleasures? At what point do they actually go beyond something I'm just finding pleasure in, and it actually starts to become unhealthy? It actually starts to become something that guilt starts to actually change the way that I'm acting, behaving with myself, with God, with other people. When our guilty pleasures go from enjoying something to relying on something, from consuming something to depending on something, from desiring something to requiring something. Does that change a little bit? Do you have some things that come to mind? I can remember about 2 months into the beginning of the lockdown in COVID, and one thing that I enjoy is craft beer. I enjoy the craft of it. I enjoy the small microbreweries. I enjoy going to a place and trying the craft brewery, whatever it is. And oftentimes with friends and with other people, Caitlin and I would always try to find ones that we like together, and just a fun thing. And about 2 months into COVID, when we weren't hanging out with anybody, there was a rhythm in my life that started to adopt where I was having a craft beer for like every night, probably 3 to 4 weeks in a row. And it wasn't necessarily the quantity, but it was the consistency. And I could remember exiting off of the 41 onto Shields, just like any other time, nothing really unique about this. And I audibly, didn't actually hear it, but I felt like I heard it. I heard God ask me, Ryan, are you depending on craft beer, or are you depending on me? And I actually felt like a conviction inside of me, realizing that a craft beer every night was starting to be something that was actually soothing me. When the world felt upside down, when we didn't feel like we had to control everything, when we didn't feel like we could make sense of things, when we had no answers to the way that life was. This season of Lent, I have given up television shows. Again, just coming off of realizing in the last couple months, days are long, we have young kids. By the time we wrestle them to bed, that is exhausting. I'm like, I just need to go watch a show just to recenter myself and to figure out where am I? Am I alive? Where's life? It feels like, and then I would watch a show, and then what would happen though is I would just feel lethargic, and I wouldn't actually feel joyful or better. I wouldn't read. I would actually stay up later, because then it was like, well, I watched one, I might as well watch, and then it's 11 o'clock, and then I'm tired the next day. This thing just started happening where I'm the things that I want to do in the evening, the things that actually give me life, I'm not doing. And it became TV. This was another guilty pleasure, to say, that started to work its way into me actually depending on it for something. And I wonder if our guilty pleasures, again, while you can find enjoyment and have fun, and there's good things that you enjoy with other people, whatever it is, I wonder how many of them are just for the sake of numbing ourselves. Where we just need to find something to numb either the external or the internal worlds. Now, if you're here this morning and you've been a part of church or life with Jesus, or maybe you're even new and you're trying to be like, I'm just going to figure this thing out with God, or this thing called church, or who's Jesus, like wherever you're at, I think, bet that we're here for a few things. And one could be that we want to hear God's voice. We actually want God to interact in our lives, to be led in some way to experience him. But when it comes to guilty pleasures, oftentimes these are things that we actually just consume our lives with more media rather than creating space to hear God's voice. We want to experience God's power in our lives. Yet through guilty pleasures, we can just seek to gain more control. We want to see God's justice in our world. Yet we never actually slow down enough to allow God to do justice inside of us. At what point do our guilty pleasures, and at what point have our guilty pleasures actually become something that we go to just to numb life, both externally and internally? And with that, we turn to the writings of Paul. He writes this to the church in Thessalonica. Now, brothers and sisters, about time and dates we do not need to write to you, for you know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying peace and safety, destruction will come on them suddenly, as labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. Now, it's verses like that, and like, I got to go back to my guilty pleasures. I don't know what just happened, destruction, like there's labor pains. Like, this doesn't sound fun. I would go rather binge some Netflix or, lo and behold, listen to some pop music. I don't know. Take that, ChatGPT. But what's happening here is he's writing to a group of people that are newly formed in life with Jesus, and there's chaos going on. There's teachers running around proclaiming the day of the Lord, meaning the return of Jesus, and the people of Jesus are actually starting to panic a little bit. Even to the point where they're like, man, if Jesus is coming back, we don't even need to work anymore, because why work if Jesus is coming and the world's going to end? And in other areas, Paul's writing them like, no, you need to keep working hard. It's actually a testimony to your faith and who God is. There's a whole piece that as the whole peace and safety piece, those who are in the midst of the Roman government and life with Rome and outside of the church, they can say, well, we have peace and safety because we have power, we have wealth, we have land, we have all the things that we need to provide. And that text says that, well, the things are like labor pains. No matter what, there's a result through that. And it's going to come. But if you keep saying peace and safety, you don't actually turn to life with God, there will become destruction. So he's actually writing to a culture that feels very unstable, to a group of people that feel like life is chaos, to a lot of people that don't actually really know what to do with the information that's being handed them. And then he says specifically to you, to us, to the church, he says, but you, brothers and sisters, are not in darkness, so that this day should surprise you like a thief. You are all children of the light and children of the day. We do not belong to the night or to the darkness. So then let us not be like others who are asleep, but let us be awake and sober. So he starts to contrast the people who are following the ways of Jesus to those who are not, to those that are of the day and those that are of the night, those that are of the light and those that are of the darkness. He's saying that there is a difference. You can actually notice who is following the ways of Jesus and who is not. Who's yelling peace and safety and avoiding the things to come, and who is actually waiting patiently on the Lord. And you would think that there's behavior differences here. And then he even says the word sober here. And sobriety doesn't just mean not drinking alcohol. Sobriety doesn't mean just not being addicted to something. Sobriety actually means clarity. clarity of consciousness, awareness, being able to notice the things around you with a clear and sober mind, to be in tune with the things that are happening around you and in you, to actually find attunement, to find one with things, to be sober to what is going on. And he continues, for those who sleep at night, and those who get drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, putting on faith and love as a breastplate and the hope of salvation as a helmet. So what's happening in culture is those who, when he compares the night to the day, those who get drunk at night, those who sleep around at night. And then he says to put on the breastplate, actually to clothe yourselves, because at that point people were unclothing themselves to participate in what could be debaucherous. And again, there's a contrast in how they're behaving, how they're posturing themselves, who they're becoming. For God did not appoint us to suffer wrath, but to receive salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. He died for us so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live together with him. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. It becomes a dependence on something different. Actually recognizing the work of Jesus in our lives. And I wonder in this season, by releasing, indulging in our guilty pleasures, if we can move from dependence on something to depending on someone. If we can move from dependence, the thing that is actually passive, that this is actually just coming at me, to actually moving to depending, the act of depending, the thing that actually takes action and it takes work, it takes awareness, it takes sober mind, to moving towards someone, and that someone is Jesus. See, ones who are asleep at night, ones who are drinking at night, ones that are in debauchery at night, they would just be finding themselves in a life of dependence on something. Oh, but to be awake, to be in the day, to be in the light, it requires you to depend on someone greater than what you could ever depend on yourself. And so what I want to do, I'm going to ask Daniel and Wesley are standing up right on time. They're going to pass out some sheets. And I'm going to invite Ish forward, and we're going to move into a time of reflection. And they're going to pass these out face down. I would ask that you keep them face down. And then I'll kind of walk us through what we're going to do. But what I want us to become aware of is this quote here. Russ Hudson says, "For me, presence is a grace offered in each moment. It allows whatever I am feeling to be transmuted into something useful for myself, for the situation I may be in, and perhaps for some greater good." See, here's what I think, is that our guilty pleasures are things that we turn to when we don't actually know what's going on inside of us. The guilty pleasures are things that I go to when I haven't actually checked the things inside of me. The guilty pleasures are the things I go to when I think they're going to solve the things that I'm feeling inside. And the more that we can actually become aware of the things that are going on internally, I believe that we're better to actually depend on someone to live in the day, to live in the night. Are you aware of the things that drive towards your actions of your guilty pleasures? I don't know about you, but I don't usually make my bad decisions when I feel connected and loved and seen by other people. You know where my bad decisions usually come from is when I feel lonely and isolated. When I feel not cared about. When I feel like there's turmoil in a relationship. Keep them face down. Keep them face down. Keep them face down. Second grade. Keep them face down. But it's the things inside that drive me towards guilty pleasures. And I wonder if growing in awareness of the things inside, we actually start to make different choices between the night and the day, between the darkness and the light. But it takes work. It takes depending on someone. So what we're going to do here in a minute is we'll eventually flip over our papers and we're going to reflect. I'll give you a few minutes. I'll give us one more quote, then I'll read something over us and we'll move into communion. What I want you to do in this moment, before we flip over, is I just want you to pause and just recognize God's presence. As we look inward, we are not doing alone. The things that come up through reflection are met by God's grace and His loving hand in your life. That He is with you, that He created you. He knows every hair on your head. He knows the things within you and around you. And He's with you. So may we never forget that as we search ourselves and we allow ourselves to be searched, it's never outside of God's love and pursuit of you. So for just a couple minutes here, you take this home and write more later. Go ahead and turn over your pages and just start to answer the questions freely and honestly, without guilt, without shame. Spend about 30 to 45 seconds on each, or maybe you find yourself being drawn to just one. One more minute. Back to that Russ Hudson quote, he says, "For me, presence is a grace offered in each moment. It allows whatever I am feeling to be transmuted into something useful for myself, for the situation I may be in, and perhaps for some greater good." Could you imagine if you spent more time reflecting on your life of the things that are below? And to actually catch them before we just turn to other things other than God. That we look to be soothed, that we look to just get through the day, that we look to find control, that we look to have power. What if we reflected on the things going internal so that it could be transmuted into something good? Something good within us, something good for others around us. But then what it takes, David Benner says, genuine transformation requires vulnerability. It is not the fact of being loved unconditionally that is life-changing. It's the risky experience of allowing myself to be loved unconditionally. Those who have gone before us have written much on how fear and guilt are connected. When we feel guilty of something, fear actually goes up because oftentimes it's a fear that I cannot be loved in the things that I'm guilty about. It's a fear that I cannot be in connection with other people when I'm guilty about something. It's a fear that God does not want to participate in my life any further because I've done something wrong. But it's vulnerability that says, God, in these feelings and these emotions and this hardship and the things I'm experiencing, the things I don't know what to do with, and the things that are overwhelming and the things that are overtaking and the things that are all consuming for me right now. It takes vulnerability to come in tune with them and say, God, help. God, be with me. God, may I depend on you more than the things that feel like quick fixes that still leave me unsatisfied. May we be a people that are willing to grow in vulnerability because I believe firmly that we will not only experience more of God in our lives, but I believe that others will experience more of God through our lives. Can we grow in the courage? Can we depend on the courage that it takes to be vulnerable, to process, to deal with the things that are deep within? So last thing, before we go into communion with eyes closed, I'm going to read a passage that includes Jesus interacting with his disciples. We're going to join them in the midst of a storm while they're in a boat. I want you to notice Jesus' movements coming towards you. I want you to hear his words of comfort, not just to them, but to you. I want you to notice the movements of how he even gets in the boat and how the storm calms, the winds decrease, all the things that are chaos around become still. Mark 6, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them. And the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Sit with that for a moment as you reflect on what you're mad about, what you're sad about, what you're anxious about, and what you're glad about. What does it look like to allow Jesus to come towards you and to say, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." and to allow him to climb into the boat with you. Why don't we stand and enter a time of communion?